either in, for example, the FDA Red Book or the OECD guidelines. And then, as I've said, after decades of marketing, we then should look to perform high-quality epidemiology studies. And when I say high-quality epidemiology studies, I mean these should be prospective studies rather than retrospective studies, and these should be randomized and double-blind. And it goes without saying that there's really no benefit of conducting any epidemiology study before the ingredient is approved. So let's look at some of the sweetener study carcinogenicity outcomes. There has been a number of epidemiology studies that have been conducted on high-intensity sweeteners, looking at carcinogenic effects. These have most commonly been conducted on groups of high-intensity sweeteners, as it's very difficult to isolate the sweetener that you're interested in. But there is some evidence of epidemiology studies on aspartame, cyclamates, saccharin, and sucralose. By and large, these epidemiology studies have shown very little. And why have they shown very little? Well, the reason is that there really has been no gold standard prospective double-blind study on any high-intensity sweetener. And in fact, it's very difficult to tease out the very low levels of exposure to a high-intensity sweetener from other background compounds which could be causing the carcinogenic effect. And as I've mentioned, it's very difficult to isolate individual sweeteners. And many of these studies that have been published and are in the public domain suffer from various biases regarding selection and recall, which confound the overall interpretation and the conclusions of these studies. So given the lack of utility of these epidemiology studies, we're really left to look at the gold standard rodent carcinogenicity studies for determining the carcinogenic potential of an ingredient like a high-intensity sweetener. And the design and conduct of these types of studies, as I've mentioned, are laid down in regulatory guidelines, the FDA Red Book, the OECD Guideline Test 451, and the OECD GLP guidelines. And these provide recommendations as to how to conduct the design of the study and how to conduct that study. And I've just listed a few examples here as to what should be built into a 2-year study. So the number of animals per group should range between 50 and 60. The dose selection, you should have at least 3 doses and a control. Again, those dose levels should be at multiples of the human estimated intake. It also provides, these guidelines provide details on the parameters that need to be measured, including hematology, clinical chemistry, as well as the number of tissues to be evaluated from a histopathological standpoint, and then the types of statistical analyses that you should conduct on the data once it's been generated. So let's look at some of the results using these gold standard protocols. And I've been through each of the individual sweeteners. Given the fact that I haven't got a great deal of time, I'm going to, I've summarized each of these onto one slide. And to start off with aspartame. Aspartame is one of the most extensively studied high-intensity sweeteners that are out there. In fact, there's 5 studies which have been conducted to recommended guidelines. 4 have been conducted in rats and 1 in mice. And the dose ranges that we look at here in these studies range up to 8 grams per kilogram. Now, let's try to put this into perspective. 8 grams per kilogram. If you or I were to eat 8 grams per kilogram of aspartame, that would be like consuming half a kilogram of aspartame per day. So these rats are getting huge amounts of aspartame on a day-to-day basis. In the initial study that was conducted, so the very first study that was conducted with aspartame, the results showed a non-statistically significant increase in brain tumors in the highest dose group. 1 out of 40 of the top dose group versus 0 in the controls in males, and 3 in the top dose group females, and there was none in the controls. The company then went back and looked at all the dose groups, including the controls, and determined from that analysis that there was no increase in brain tumor incidence in any dose group. Subsequent to this study, there's been 3 additional rat studies and an additional mouse study. And again, none of these studies have shown any incidence of brain tumors. In addition to the studies that have been conducted by the company, the National Toxicology Program in the United States have also undertaken 3 transgenic mouse studies where they're looking at studies which show a higher propensity to show tumors and a decreased latency time. And again, all of these studies were shown to be negative. So there's no evidence of carcinogenicity of aspartame in any of these rodent studies. Likewise, with the daughters of aspartame, neotame and advantame. For advantame, at dosages up to 5% in the diet, no neoplastic effects were noted. For neotame, at the top dose, there was a significant increase in liver adenomas and lung carcinomas in males and females respectively, but this didn't reach biological significance, as when you combine the tumor types, there was no statistically significant findings, and there were no pre-neoplastic changes. So again, in conclusion, these aspartame derivatives are not carcinogenic in rodents. Moving on to acesulfam K. The company did a study in mice, a large study, up to 30,000 parts per million in the diet, and this study showed no neoplastic changes. In a study in rats, using in utero exposure, so a multi-generation type study, again at dosages up to 30,000 ppm, there was an increase in pulmonary lymphoreticular tumors, but this only achieved statistical significance in females. They did, however, repeat this study in a strain of rat which had a lower background incidence of these pulmonary tumors, and they followed the same protocol, went up to 120 weeks, and this study showed no neoplastic effects. So, and again, based on these findings, the NTP did their own analysis using these transgenic models, and they fed acesulfam K in the diet for up to 9 months, and there was no increase in neoplasms. So the weight of evidence again shows that acesulfam K is not carcinogenic to rodents. Cyclamate. As I mentioned earlier, saccharin and cyclamate were the original high-intensity sweeteners, so the studies that have been conducted on these materials were conducted many, many years ago, and probably not up to today's standards. However, based on the numerous studies that have been conducted on cyclamate, there is no evidence of carcinogenicity of cyclamate to cyclamate or its metabolite cyclohexylamine. And in fact, there's been a carcinogenicity study in a monkey which was published in in the year 2000, which showed that when they fed monkeys over a period of 20 years at high dosage levels, there was no evidence of carcinogenic potential. In addition, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC as it's better known, evaluated all of the data on cyclamate, and they concluded that on the basis of inadequate evidence in both humans and experimental animals, cyclamates are not classifiable as to their carcinogenicity to humans. So again, the weight of evidence here indicates that cyclamate is not carcinogenic to laboratory animals. Like aspartame, saccharin has been studied extensively in the rodent model, and there is a reason for this. Studies done in the 70s and 80s using a multi-generational protocol showed that if you fed saccharin in the diet at 3% or more, these animals at the high dose groups were associated with urinary bladder tumors. And this set off a whole host of mechanistic type of studies to determine really what was going on with the formation of the tumors in the rat bladder. And Professor Cohen, who's a carcinogenicity expert, discovered that due to the fact that rats have a unique combination of high urinary pH with a high calcium phosphate level and high protein levels in urine, that this forms microcrystals in the urinary bladder, and it is these microcrystals that damage the lining or the epithelial of the bladder. And the bladder responds by overproducing cells, leading to the tumor formation. Just like I mentioned with cyclamate, IARC has also reviewed all of this data on saccharin, and again, they have concluded that sodium saccharin produces urothelial bladder tumors in rats by a non-DNA reactive mechanism. So it's a non-genotoxic mechanism. And this mechanism is not relevant to humans because of the critical interspecies differences in urinary composition. So human urine is not equivalent to rat urine in terms of high pH and the levels of protein and calcium phosphate. So again, we can conclude that while saccharin is carcinogenic to the rat at high dose levels, this bears no relevance to the human safety, aspect. For sucralose, 2 studies have been performed on sucralose, a mouse study and a rat study. Both were fed up to 3% in the diet using standard protocols laid down by the FDA, and neither of these studies showed any effects on tumor incidence, and so we can conclude that sucralose is not carcinogenic to rodents. Steviol glycosides. As I mentioned, there's numerous steviol glycosides. Around 40 have been discovered to date. And because they're all metabolized in a very similar manner, in that the sugar moieties are cleaved and it's the steviol backbone that's absorbed and into the systemic circulation, we can therefore use, because of the similarity in metabolism, we can therefore use the studies that have been conducted on stevia side, looking at the carcinogenicity of this material. And there's been 2 published studies in this regard, one conducted by Toyota in 1997 and the other by Zilli in 1992. And these studies form the basis for showing that stevioglycosides are not carcinogenic to rodents. So just to summarize all of that data, which I've been through, I know, very, very quickly, all of these sweeteners have been subject to extensive testing for carcinogenicity in chronic rodent studies. And the majority of these, other than for cyclamate per se, most of these protocols have used the official guidelines as laid down by FDA or OECD. And other than saccharin, none of these studies have shown any evidence of carcinogenicity in rodents. And as I mentioned, the reason for the effects of saccharin, this bears no carcinogenic risk to humans as it's a rat-specific mechanism. Now I'd like to move on to what I've called recent controversies, which has probably led to all the social media and internet revelations that I showed you earlier. And this is related to some lifetime rodent studies that were conducted by the Ramazzini Institute in Italy. The researchers there at the institute in Bologna have reported on 3 rodent carcinogenicity studies, 3 with aspartame and 1 with sucralose. And in all of these studies that they've conducted, all of them have shown carcinogenic effects. However, they've used non-standard protocols in this evaluation. So I'm just going to go through the results as has been published in their papers. The first paper that came out was a study conducted with aspartame in rats, and they fed large numbers of animals over a lifetime. So whereas I mentioned previously that the validated protocols that are laid down by FDA and the OECD, which only lasts 2 years, what the Ramazzini Institute did, that they fed the animals over a lifetime. And so they fed them until the animals died, and then they did the histopathology. And what they found in this initial study was that there was an increase in malignant tumor-bearing animals, an increase in lymphomas and leukemias, and an increase in the tumors of the renal pelvis and ureter in females, and increased incidence of tumors in the peripheral nerves of males. So a large number of tumors which were never identified in the original studies that were conducted by the industry. They then went on to repeat this study, looking at in utero exposure, but at lower dose levels. And again, they reported significant increases in malignant tumor-bearing males and a significant incidence of lymphomas, leukemias in the high-dose animals, and an increase in mammary cancers in females. They then moved on to do some studies in mice, and again they found incidence of increased carcinomas in the males in those studies conducted with aspartame, and with leukemias and lymphomas in the study conducted with mice. All of these studies have been published and are out there in the public domain. And as a result of the consequences of those studies and the issues that it raised from a scientific and regulatory perspective, both the United States FDA and the European Food Safety Authority both looked into the conduct and the results of these studies in a very big way. And so they outline some significant shortcomings and flaws in these studies. And I've just tried to outline to you a number of these limitations that were raised by these two regulatory authorities. So these aren't my own opinions. These are opinions that were raised by EFSA or the FDA or the US EPA or the NTP. So as you can see, there's a whole host of limitation shortcomings with the protocol design and the results. So these weren't designed to GLP or Red Book or OECD compliant protocols. Both EFSA and the US FDA have criticized the lifetime exposure protocol because they say it produces uninterpretable results due to a rapid increase in neoplasm development beyond the age of 2 years. So again, without putting a finer point on it, both EFSA and the US FDA has discredited this type of protocol. EFSA also noticed an apparent lack of randomization of the animals. There was no